Today, we're talking about how to shape player motivation, how to get players motivated, how to give them what they want, and sometimes withhold what they want, so that they really want to play our game, and so that they have a fun, interesting time, and so that they get to play in interesting ways. Lots of times what's going to happen is if the game has something that just rewards player for doing it, a player may just choose to keep doing it. And we're going to talk about preventing that as well. We are going to be borrowing a lot from behavioral psychology. So how do people tend to behave and what tends to motivate people? So behavioral psychology says that there's actually two types of motivation. There's intrinsic, which comes from intrinsic, which comes from inside of you, and extrinsic, which comes from the outside. Now, what do I mean by that? Intrinsic motivation is when you want to do something just to do it. You just feel like taking a walk, and you take a walk. You're not walking to, say, lose weight, or you're not walking because you know somebody's gonna pay you for walking, like their dog or something. No, you're intrinsically motivated. You feel like, I want to get some fresh air. I want to get those feelings, and that's what I feel like doing. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is when you're doing something in order to achieve a goal. So you know there's something on the other side of that thing that you're gonna do, and that's why you're doing the thing. So that's like, I'm going to run a marathon so that I get a medal, or I'm going to run a marathon so that I raise money. I'm going to do my job because I want to get paid. And we do need to be careful with that, but we'll get to that in a moment. In game design terms, what's intrinsic motivation? Well, intrinsic motivation in game design is when players are just motivated to do things, and I think kind of the simplest form of it in board games would be like your theme, your setting is kind of going to set up that intrinsic motivation, and ultimately that's going to lead to something called a player fantasy. And the player fantasy is what a player wants to do when they hear about your game. So if, say you've got a game about knights dueling or jousting, well, they're gonna want to have lances, they're gonna want to actually do the joust, they're gonna want to like have armor and so on. Or another really good example is sandbox games. So I grew up playing a lot of Grand Theft Auto, and I was way too young for Grand Theft Auto, but it's a really good example of how your player fantasy is, what if I was in a city, like most of us are, but I didn't have a moral system. There weren't any consequences to my actions, so I could just mess with people. I could take what I want. I could be a criminal. Basically, that's what the player fantasy is. And it's really fun because we don't get to do that in real life for obvious reasons. But what you'll notice in games like GTA, or board game equivalents would be like Western Legends or Sleeping Gods, is that players can spend a lot of time intrinsically motivated, just exploring, just kind of figuring out fun stuff to do, and you as the game designer don't necessarily need to push them to do that stuff. Now, on the other hand, extrinsic motivation is when we offer a reward to players. We tell them to do stuff. So if there's a reward, this can be things like missions, or goals, victory points. I think all Euro games have some form of this, and most games have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We'll talk more about the specific ways to use them, but one thing you should know is that if you have intrinsic motivation, adding in rewards and goals and victory points can actually paradoxically harm the player experience. If you find players are just having fun doing stuff, sometimes you don't and shouldn't reward it, because what will happen is players will be like, well, it's not me choosing to do this, I'm doing this because the game is giving me stuff, and they're actually gonna stop enjoying the thing that they were doing when they weren't being rewarded for it. There's a fascinating experiment that was done on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where they split children up into groups, and one group they asked to just draw a picture, and they gave them like an hour or whatever time frame, and the other group they told them that if they draw a picture they would be rewarded. I don't remember how, doesn't really matter. And what turned out is the group that just drew for the heck of it did a much better job with their drawings. On the other hand, the other group that did it for the reward just did it kind of quickly because they were like, I'm going to draw so that I get this other thing. And they weren't having as much fun with it. They spent a lot less time on it. And yeah, basically not what's expected in our society, which is, you do stuff and you get paid. Well, sometimes you getting a reward can make the thing less fun if you stop doing the thing just for the thing. So in game design, we want to be careful. Let's talk a little bit more about in game design, kind of what we're doing. So when we have a game, we've got a player, and the player is going to take an action, and then the game is going to react to the player. Now in game design terms, or in game theory, this is called a feedback loop. And that is what we're doing when we give a player a reward or a punishment. And they're very useful and they're great to have because feedback loops can teach players. They can teach players, hey, this is good to do, this is not good to do, and it can get players to play in the way that you want them to play, which is the interesting way. You don't want players just doing the same thing over and over again. The general piece of advice for feedback loops is to keep them short if possible. And that's because what I mentioned is the learning of how to do things. Well, if you don't immediately react to a player behavior, say if a player, maybe in a worker placement game, places their worker, if you don't immediately give them what they want, players can have a worse experience with the game because they didn't understand whether what they did was good or if it was bad. So we've got this feedback loop, and the game is going to give players rewards and punishments or punishments. Let's talk about rewards first. And I do think rewards are what you want to be giving more than punishments, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But when you're rewarding players, what do you want? Well, again, we can look at behavioral psychology, and we can look at the work specifically of B.H. Skinner, who did a lot of experiments with pigeons, teaching them all sorts of different behaviors through rewarding them.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment.
So what we learn from Skinner is, for one thing, he says that in order for him to be able to teach his pigeons what to do, he needs to keep them hungry. And I think the same is true in game design. You want to keep your players hungry, because if you're just giving them out resources and stuff willy-nilly, it starts feeling like a chore for one thing, and then you devalue whatever you're giving players. So you kind of want like a breadcrumb approach. A reward doesn't need to be big to be impactful. You want, remember that feedback loop. You just want to tell players, hey, you did a good thing, or hey, don't do that if we're talking about punishments later. Now, another thing that we learn from behavioral psychology is that you don't want your reward to be the same necessarily every time.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that.
He says that the best way to teach and to have somebody most motivated is with irregular reinforcement. So when you reward somebody for doing something, the most normal thing for them to do, whether they're a human or a pigeon or a dog, is they're going to do the thing again, right? They're going to repeat the behavior that was rewarded. And in games, that can lead to something called grinding, which we don't want, right? Because what grinding is when a player is like, oh, this is the best thing for me to do, I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to do it again. And you get to that problem of the game feeling boring but the player making a choice which feels correct. So the player is gonna force themselves to do something they don't want to do for that end goal. So this is where our extrinsic motivation is a problem. So what Skinner says is that the best way to get players the most motivated is with irregular reinforcement. Now this is something that you should also be careful with, because this is what makes games addictive. This is how gambling works. In our games, that means changing the quantity of the reward, the quality of the reward. It could even be how you gain the reward, when the reward is given, and so on. So irregular reinforcement can keep players engaged, just changing the reward. Finally, let's talk about punishments. I know a lot of game designers love to punish their players, but we want to be careful and we want to ask ourselves, why are we punishing players? I think there's two good ways to use them. One is risk. So you can punish players if they've taken a risk and if they know that there is that risk to them. So you want them to have chosen this themselves, and yeah, if they did the risky thing and it didn't work in their favor, they can be punished. On the other hand, you can use punishment as a learning tool, and this is very cool because like in video games, one of the best examples would be checkpoints. So when you have a checkpoint in a video game, typically after the checkpoint, if you encounter something difficult, what's gonna happen is you're gonna fail, and then you're gonna be brought back to the checkpoint. And what's the punishment here? Well, the punishment here is you're losing progress. But what the game is telling you, the feedback that you're gaining, and you're gaining it quick, is that you didn't do it correctly. So go back and try something else. And so the feedback loop through punishment is teaching you, hey, don't do this way. Figure out how to do this correctly. So you can teach players through punishments, or you can allow players to take risks. Now, in the board game context, there are many things you can do. You can figure out what it is for your game. I would avoid things like loss of a turn. Unless your game is Russian roulette, there is not, it's very rarely the case where you want to be punishing players through losing turns. It just feels really bad. You're not included in the group. I would say be careful with that. A risk type of punishment is something like debts. In the West Kingdom trilogy, players can choose to gain a debt, which if they don't repay by the end of the game, it's minus points. Another example of this would be sometimes games allow you to take quests, but if you don't finish the quest at the end of the game, they're worth minus points. So this would be like above and below is a good example of this. But whatever way you choose to punish your players, you want to make sure that players understand why they're being punished, because otherwise it can be really frustrating. And you want players typically to have a way to not take a punishment. So like have a counter or avoid punishment. Because you'll have a lot of players that, there is a thing called loss aversion, which we'll talk about in other videos, but in general, give your players an out. Like give your players a choice, and you can make that an interesting decision as well. Let's stop here. If you need more specific help with your game, I'm currently offering one-on-ones, which you can find in the description. Thank you so much for watching.